It's 1979. The world was buzzing with excitement as the Sony Walkman revolutionized the way we experienced music. Madonna took her first steps into pop stardom with her debut album, and let's not forget, every kid's relentless pleas for a trip to McDonald's to score that coveted Happy Meal toy. However, beyond the disco beats, Happy Meals, and bell-bottom jeans of the era lies a pivotal moment in history that continues to shape modern geopolitics today. Within the walls of a seemingly ordinary building, the air grows thick with tension, and a diplomatic storm was brewing. 52 Americans were held captive for an astonishing 444 days. Not just anywhere, but within the sovereign territory of their own country, the U.S. Embassy in Iran. It's important to understand that embassies under international law are considered extensions of the countries they represent, not the nations they're located in. So what happens when this sacred rule is disrupted? This isn't merely a tale of a distant crisis. It's a gripping dive into the intricate choreography of international relations. The Hollywood blockbuster Argo beautifully visualized one thrilling chapter of the hostage crisis. But the bigger story delves far beyond cinematic tension, and the stakes are higher than ever, as the past continues to cast a long shadow over the relationship between the USA and Iran.
Clear to the Iranians, be careful.
Recent tensions, the conflicts and proxy wars in the Middle East, nuclear deal negotiations, and ongoing regional challenges all trace their roots in the history we're about to uncover. Events like the embassy attacks in Beirut, Kenya, Tanzania, and Benghazi also challenge our understanding of these diplomatic safe havens. Join us on this extraordinary journey as we step back into an era where groovy tunes masked underlying political symphonies. By the end, you'll gain a deeper understanding of the key events, decisions, and power dynamics that have shaped the present geopolitical landscape, and discover how the lessons of the past inform the strategies and actions of today's world leaders. So, why does this Iranian standoff matter in our current era? And how can understanding it provide insights into the broader strokes of diplomacy? What were the lasting effects, and how did this moment shape the present we are living in? Welcome to From Pharaohs to Presidents. Let's dive in. In the post-World War II era, a new kind of confrontation emerged. One not marked by open warfare, but instead by covert operations, proxy wars, and a perpetual game of geopolitical chess. This was the Cold War, an ideological and strategic battle between the world's two superpowers, the United States, US, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. As these giants locked horns, nations across the globe became entangled in their power play. In the Middle East, with its vast oil reserves and pivotal geopolitical position, was no exception. At the heart of the Cold War was the ideological rift between the capitalist West, led by the US, and the communist East, led by the USSR. These contrasting worldviews extended far beyond economic systems, touching on freedoms, governance, and global influence. The superpowers were locked in a race for dominance, seeking allies and influence in every corner of the globe to tip the balance in their favor. Every regional conflict, every revolution, and every diplomatic incident was viewed through the lens of this grand standoff. The Middle East, rich in history and culture, became an attractive piece in this global game, not just for its historical importance, but for two main reasons: oil and ideology. Oil, the black gold, was the lifeblood of modern economies. The vast reserves of the Middle East were essential for both superpowers, not just for their own energy needs, but as a tool of economic influence. Control or influence over these reserves meant power, and both the US and the USSR knew it. It was not just about direct access to oil, but the ability to influence its supply, its price, and its routes of transportation. Ideologically, the Middle East presented a battleground for the hearts and minds of its people. With newly independent nations emerging from the vestiges of colonial rule, there was a thirst for identity, governance, and development models. The US promoted its brand of democracy and capitalism as the ideal path, while the USSR propagated its socialist and anti-imperialist credentials. This is really important, as the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which led to the hostage crisis, was a manifestation of these underlying tensions. It represented a rejection of both Western influence, particularly US involvement, and refused collaboration with the USSR, which showcased the complex situation in the Middle East, as well as putting into motion Islamism as an ideological structure, for which we will go into more detail later. In the early 1950s, within Tehran's bustling streets, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh rose to prominence, capturing the spirit of a nation and the wary eyes of the world. Mossadegh, with his signature salt and pepper mustache and passionate oratory, wasn't just any political leader. He was a beacon of democratic hopes for the Iranian populace. A Western-educated lawyer ruling in the Middle East, Mossadegh was a contradiction to many. But to the Iranians, he embodied the aspirations of a newly awakened nation seeking autonomy and dignity. Democratically elected as prime minister, he championed the cause of Iranian nationalism, advocating for a future where Iran would take control of its own destiny, free from foreign interference. Central to this nationalistic fervor was oil, which coursed through the veins of the nation, not just as a resource but as a symbol of Iran's sovereignty. Mossadegh, sensing the winds of change, spearheaded the move to nationalize Iran's oil industry and take it out of the hands of foreign corporate control, which was mostly British. This audacious step was not just an economic maneuver, it was a declaration of autonomy, a message to the world that Iran was no longer an imperial playground. However, while Iranians celebrated, the West trembled. Britain, in particular, saw its interest in the Anglo-Iranian oil company, now BP, threatened, and the US feared the spread of nationalism might tilt the Cold War balance. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, from the US, and the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, from the UK, began plotting in the shadows to overthrow Mossadegh and put in power someone who would be willing to sell Iranian oil to them. With the desire to have cheap oil combined with the idea of battling communism in the Middle East, the UK and the USA proceeded with Operation Ajax, a mission aimed at toppling Mossadegh. The streets of Tehran became a backdrop for a spy thriller. Bribes, propaganda, orchestrated protests, and cloak-and-dagger tactics were all employed to destabilize Mossadegh's government. The coup was swift. Mossadegh was ousted, and in his place, the monarchy was restored with Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi at the helm. The Shah, a friend to the West, was seen as a bulwark against communism and a guarantor of Western oil interests. For many Iranians, however, this marked a tragic moment, the subversion of their democratic aspirations and the beginning of an autocratic regime that would last for another quarter century. Iran saw a rapid change, and the country started to look like a Western country in the center of the Middle East. Western music floated from bustling cafes, women in miniskirts and headscarves walked side by side, and cinemas showcased both Hollywood blockbusters and Persian classics. The Shah, with a vision of a modern and westernized Iran, embarked on ambitious reforms. Infrastructure, healthcare, and education witnessed an upsurge, and the old was rapidly making way for the new. But this dance with modernity was not just cultural, it was political and economic, aligning Iran closely with Western powers, especially the US. But beneath this shimmering facade of modernity lay a darker underbelly. The secret police, Savak, became the Shah's shadow, omnipresent yet often invisible. With a mandate to protect the monarchy, Savak was notorious for its heavy-handed tactics. Dissidents were silenced, opposition quashed and imprisoned, and an air of fear permeated the political landscape. The Shah's regime, while progressive in many aspects, was authoritarian at its core. Economically, the nation was in flux. Oil wealth filled the nation's coffers, leading to rapid urbanization and the growth of the middle class. Yet, the fruits of progress were not evenly distributed. Skyscrapers rose, casting shadows over slums. The rural populace, witnessing the dazzling prosperity of cities from afar, grappled with feelings of exclusion. As urban centers thrived, many rural areas languished, sowing seeds of discontent. As development surged, disparities became glaring. While wealth, construction, and business flourished, Islam, once the cornerstone of Iranian identity, seemed to recede into the background. The soul of Iran, its deep-rooted spirituality, began to stir. The Shah's secular policies often clashed with the conservative values of the Iranian populace. The mosques, silent observers of the changing landscape, became centers of resistance and debate. And if you're finding this content valuable and insightful, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being a part of our journey. As time went by, the people's unrest in Iran became an increasingly powerful undercurrent, and the conservative opposition, with the clergy at its helm, began to challenge the Shah's vision. Ayatollah Khomeini, a figurehead in this religious resurgence, became a symbol of resistance, encapsulating the frustrations of a society that felt it was losing its identity. Long before the revolution's flames ignited, Khomeini had been a vocal critic of the Shah's regime, calling for a return to religious and traditional values. This defiance came at a cost. The Shah's regime, intolerant of challenges, exiled him. But exile only amplified Khomeini's voice, turning him from a mere critic to a beacon of hope and resistance for millions. By the late 1970s, Iran was simmering with discontent. A volatile mix of civil unrest, fueled by economic downturns and the oppressive tactics of the Shah's regime, was brewing. Skyrocketing inflation, unemployment, and the evident socio-economic disparities pushed many to the brink. The economic boom seemed short-lasting, or the money simply did not go into the people's hands. The educated youth, feeling both empowered and restless, began to question the status quo. The whispered stories of Savak's brutalities added to the angst, as the unrest evolved in a revolution. Protests erupted across the nation. What started as isolated outcries soon merged into a sea of people, unified in their call for change. The Shah, once an unassailable monarch, found himself isolated. Despite his attempts to quell the uprisings, the momentum was unstoppable. Realizing the inevitability of the tide, the Shah departed from Iran, leaving behind a power vacuum. In early 1979, a chartered Air France jet touched down in Tehran. Stepping out was the exiled visionary Khomeini, returning not as a dissident, but as a leader of a revolution. Crowds beyond count thronged to greet him, their voices echoing with chants of reverence. The ensuing months saw Iran undergo a metamorphosis. The monarchy was dismantled, and in its place, with overwhelming public support, the Islamic Republic of Iran was established, with Khomeini as its supreme leader. This is one of the most important moments in the modern history of the Middle East, because it brought to an end the 39-year bi-ideological dominance of nationalism and socialism. The revolution was a significant event in the modern history of political Islam, and provided a tangible model of an Islamist state, which had significant repercussions throughout the Muslim world, most notably in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Lebanon. Jimmy Carter attempted a diplomatic approach to address tensions with Iran. However, his decision to grant asylum to the Shah, who fled Iran, whom most Iranians deeply resented, complicated and deeply undermined U.S. Iran diplomatic efforts. To many Iranians, this was history repeating itself, a déjà vu of foreign interference harking back to the 1953 coup. The decision ignited fury, with many suspecting the US was plotting another intervention. On November 4th, a group of armed students stormed the US Embassy, and the world watched as 66 Americans became pawns in a high-stakes geopolitical standoff that would endure for 444 harrowing days. The diplomats and staff suddenly found themselves facing captivity, uncertainty, and fear. In the White House, President Jimmy Carter faced an unprecedented crisis. Each tick of the clock didn't just signify prolonged captivity for the hostages, but also increased pressure on his presidency. The Iranian revolutionaries demanded that the US send the Shah back to Iran so he could be put to trial and executed. The US government did not accept, as the Shah had cancer and was undergoing medical treatment there, later traveling to Egypt where he died after a year in 1980. Additionally, the Iranians demanded that the US release billions in frozen Iranian assets held in American banks, return the wealth believed to have been extracted from Iran by the Shah, and provide an acknowledgement and apology for its historical interference in Iranian affairs, notably the CIA's role in the 1953 coup that reinstated the Shah. It's important to note that, as we mentioned, originally 66 Americans were taken hostage, but early into the crisis, 13 were released the same month. An interesting fact is that not all Americans at the embassy were captured. 6 American diplomats managed to evade capture and found refuge in the residences of the Canadian ambassador and the deputy chief of mission of the Canadian embassy. Their escape from Iran was facilitated by a covert CIA operation, in cooperation with the Canadian government. The group left Iran using Canadian passports, with a cover story that they were a Canadian film crew scouting locations for a science fiction film. This daring operation was dramatized in the 2012 movie Argo. Definitely check it out if you haven't seen it. In the late 1970s, American television audiences found their evening relaxation interrupted by harrowing scenes from Tehran. Enraged protesters, burning flags, and fervent anti-Western sentiments became common sights. As the hostage crisis unfurled, it wasn't just a distant diplomatic conflict. It dominated the television landscape, becoming almost a daily fixture in households. This coverage reached its epitome with ABC's Nightline, hosted by Ted Koppel, originally titled The Iran Crisis – America Held Hostage. This program became the primary source of updates for many. Each episode concluded with Koppel marking the days the hostages had been held, a grim tally like Day 150, Day 235, and Day 444, underscoring the protracted nature of the crisis and the hostages' ongoing ordeal. However, this intense spotlight also complicated the situation. Continuous coverage meant that every potential solution, every diplomatic effort was under scrutiny, while the US government was under pressure to do something. Any mistake, especially a failed rescue attempt if broadcasted, had the potential to further endanger the hostages. The Carter administration was acutely aware of this, particularly with the 1980 presidential elections looming. On the streets, crimes and discrimination towards Muslims and Iranians were on the rise. Carter championed diplomacy, but that did not work, so he proceeded with economic sanctions on weapons and oil, which were also unsuccessful. As negotiations stalled, a bold rescue mission was launched. Operation Eagle Claw, fraught with misfortunes, ended in tragic failure as the helicopters malfunctioned or crashed, further complicating the situation and casting a shadow over Carter's re-election bid. Exactly 1 year after the hostages were taken, on November 4th, 1980, the US elections were held, where Carter lost and Ronald Reagan won the presidency. Carter stayed involved in the diplomatic process with Iran until the last day of his presidency, and was drawing the crisis to an end. Under the mediation of Algeria, intricate negotiations between the US and Iran culminated in the Algiers Accords. Among its stipulations, the US pledged not to interfere in Iran's internal affairs, and assets were to be unfrozen. And then, on January 20th, 1981, the same day as Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as the President of the United States, the world watched with bated breath. 52 Americans, after 444 days in captivity, were released. As they cheered in the plane, crying in disbelief, but deeply scarred from the captivity, with some of them suffering from PTSD. Their freedom marked not just the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of a new era of U.S.-Iranian relations, forever damaged by the memories of those tense days. After 444 harrowing days, the hostages were finally released. Yet the scars of this prolonged standoff would shape the relationship between the US and Iran for decades. Instead of diplomatic reconciliation, what followed was suspicion, mistrust, and a series of icy interactions that froze the once collaborative relationship. No more were the days of mutual cooperation. Now, both nations viewed each other through wary lenses. American policies increasingly swayed away from Iran, which alongside Iraq and North Korea was a part of an axis of evil, as George W. Bush put it in the early 2000s. Amidst this geopolitical chessboard, Iran emerged as a very strong player. While many Middle Eastern countries had their allegiances defined by the Cold War's bipolar paradigm, post-revolutionary Iran chose a different path. It wasn't merely anti-American. It positioned itself as a guardian of Shia Islam, challenging both Western powers and its neighboring Sunni-majority states. In the period that followed, Iran expanded its regional influence. The removal of Saddam Hussein through the invasion of Iraq opened doors for Iran to exert its influence across the Middle East more extensively. Today, Iran stands as one of the most formidable powers in the region, maintaining a tense relationship with the US. As the chapters of history turn and the world evolves, the Iran hostage crisis remains a poignant reminder of the intricate dance of diplomacy, the lasting impacts of historical events, and the fragility of international relations. How do you think the lessons of 1979 shaped today's political landscape? Today, as we witness the ebb and flow of global politics, the lessons from 1979 echo loudly. They challenge us to approach international relations with understanding, nuance, and respect for historical contexts. In a rapidly changing world, it's essential to remember the past, not just as a series of dates and events, but as a compass, guiding our steps in an uncertain future. The U.S.-Iran saga is but one story among many, underscoring the need for dialogue, empathy, and a commitment to peace, today more than ever. Do you believe that by truly understanding history, we can pave a way for a more peaceful future? As viewers and citizens of the global community, our responsibility is not just to remember, but to learn, to question, and to strive for a world where conflict gives way to understanding. I'd love to hear your thoughts and insights on this pivotal moment in history. How do you think it has shaped the world we live in today, and are there any lessons learned? Or are we forgetting and ignoring the past, especially considering the multiple wars and conflicts that have started in the past decade? Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one. The United States, US, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR.